Greetings, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. Plants and practices that pamper pollinators. So glad that you took some time out of your day to join us, and welcome. My name is James, and I will be guiding you through this subject today. And if you're watching us in a recorded fashion, we welcome you as well. Um, I am James Stevenson at the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences, the Extension Services, and we provide a lot of research-based information for the citizens of Pinellas County on a variety of topics. We're probably best known for our landscape advice, and however, I am lucky enough to work within the natural resource conservation section of the Extension Services, coming to you from a wonderful place called Brooker Creek Preserve, which is pristine. Well, I wouldn't call it pristine, but it's definitely undeveloped Pinellas County. Pinellas is our most densely populated county in Florida, and we're also the smallest. And those two things kind of lead us to be a big city of 1 million people. So our natural areas are very, very important for the native plants and animals that historically have been found in Pinellas, not least of which our pollinators, and that's what brings us here today. I am, however, just the messenger. I am a student, as you all are, of plants and practices that pamper pollinators, but I want to introduce you to two of our county's few real experts on the subject. Liz Childress is at Weeden Island Preserve. She is a field botanist, field biologist, entomologist, all these things, but she also is tethered to a desk. So you have access to Liz if you were to venture to Weeden Island Preserve or look her up at our various county websites. Um, and we have Clint Gibson, who is a field entomologist at the Daniels Lab at the Florida Museum of Natural History in Gainesville. Now, he's much more difficult to get hold of. So I'm standing on their shoulders today as we bring you this interesting topic on getting the pollinators what they need in our own sphere of influence. So let's go ahead and get into it. I do want to invite you to send your questions via the Q&A feature, which you will find in your dashboard there. We do also have the chat feature enabled. If you have any particular questions about Brooker Creek or Weeden Island or how to get in touch with Liz, that sort of thing, Julia is our moderator today, and she'll be active in the chat. But if you want to send me a question about the presentation, please avail yourselves of the Q&A. So as we get into it, the things that I'd like to cover today include the different groups of pollinators. The whole idea of pollinator is not restricted to a particular group of insects by any stretch of the imagination, although pollinators are often considered as a single thing. So we're going to take a look at the different groups of pollinators and the differences between them. Then we'll have a look at what pollinators in general, all of them, prefer. What are their preferences, pollinator preferences? And then some of the plants that are particularly interesting to our native pollinators. And then we'll get into some of the best practices to make your landscape, whatever that may be, the very most welcoming to pollinators. And what I hope to achieve today is to, number one, open your eyes to the diversity of pollinators that we have in Pinellas County and give you some confidence that you can make a difference, even if it's just one tiny step. The sphere of possibilities for creating a good and healthy habitat for our endangered pollinators is vast, and just the smallest thing can make the biggest difference. So that's what I'm hoping for you today. So we're starting with these pollinator groups. And of course, there's the bees, right? We all know that bees are pollinators. They are probably the premier pollinators in North America and in the Southeast United States. But our native bees are probably invisible to most of you. So we will take a very detailed look, in particular, at our native bee species. There are also flies that are important pollinators. And this photograph of a fly by our friend Brian, you can see that this particular fly has a lot of characteristics of a fuzzy bee, right down to the fuzz. And flies can be very, very effective pollinators to our native plants. Beetles as well. There are many flowers that are specially constructed to accommodate the activity and to welcome various beetle species. Now, butterflies are often considered the pollinators, and people will plant what they call a pollinator garden, and their real objective is to attract butterflies because they're pretty, and I agree, and I'm totally behind that. But butterflies themselves, by and large, aren't that good at pollinating. They are not that important as pollinators. I'm not saying they're not pollinators, but they're just not very good at it. It's not they like the nectar a lot more. And there's nothing wrong with creating a habitat that's safe and welcoming for butterflies. But moths, on the other hand, believe it or not, as prissy as the butterflies are at not wanting to get dirty pollen all over them, the moths that have the ability to feed um, certainly don't mind rolling around in a flower and getting covered in pollen. So the moths are actually much more effective pollinators than the butterflies, even though they're in the same group of flying insects. And finally, believe it or not, like it or not, wasps actually fill a ecological niche as important pollinators. So one of the lessons today is going to be to tolerate the variety of pollinators that we have and make the environment that you have administration over as welcoming to all of these pollinator groups. But as I mentioned before, I wanted to introduce you to our native bees because likely you're not familiar with many of these native bees. They're pretty small, but they are incredibly, by and large, they are incredibly colorful and arguably quite fun to watch. Like this little mason bee, this little pretty blue metallic mason bee. It's called a mason bee because it actually works in cement. Cement is its um, material of choice. So it is a true mason. Here it is visiting a pennyroyal plant, not honeybees. Honeybees are not our concern. Honeybees are the concern of the agricultural community because honeybees are an agricultural commodity. And yes, honeybees are adorable. And yes, honeybees are important. They are very important to our agricultural industry. In fact, they are part of the agricultural mechanism in the world, not least of which in Florida and the United States. But like I said, they are an agricultural commodity and their problems belong to the agricultural community to solve. Wild European honeybees in Florida are actually competitors of our native honeybees, and they are actually, in some places and in some cases, outcompeting our native honeybees. And many, you will see, many of our wildflowers depend on our native species for their abundance. So even though the honeybees have their own problems, they have their own lobby and they have their own industry behind them to solve their problems. And we have the capability and we have the capacity to help our natives, including some of our native bumblebees. We have about three or four species of bumblebees, and they're in unmistakable black and yellow, big and fuzzy. They buzz very loudly. Early in the spring, it's the queen bumblebees that are out first. They often overwinter and will start a whole new colony every year. And they literally bumble around with their hairy selves, bouncing off of flowers and visiting here and there. Another large black and yellow bee include the carpenter bees. They look very bumble-like. They're about the same size. They make about the same noise. But the way that I can distinguish what I think is a carpenter bee when it passes by is that they're overall more shiny black. They lack the abundance of fuzz that our native bumblebee species have. Their head is quite shining. You can see in these two different photographs, here's the bumblebee. You can see that it's got some facial hair. The carpenter bee, on the other hand, is much smoother, shinier, and their abdomen or their butt is the same, much shinier in appearance, especially early in the season when those differences are more obvious. There are leafcutter bees, tiny little leafcutter bees. This one is about the size of a peanut, if that gives you an idea of sizes. A Spanish peanut, you know, the kind with the red skins. Anyway, leafcutter bees, and they do just that. They visit the edges of fresh leaves and they cut very distinctive and very symmetrical circles out of leaves, and they use those cut leaves to line their nests. There are mason bees, like I mentioned before, that use cement as a building material. This is a little blue mason bee on a thistle. And this bee is visiting a thistle. This is actually a specialist. This particular mason bee only or specializes in thistle, only visits or specializes in visiting thistle flowers. So to benefit this bee, we need to make sure that thistles are not eradicated from all landscapes in our county. Thistle might be considered a weed, and we'll see why when we get into the plants a bit later. There is another species of osmia called the blue orchard bee, and the blue orchard bee does not occur in Florida. It is, however, a native bee that is cultivated as an alternative to the European honeybee. So encouraging this bee, cultivating this bee, providing for this species is beneficial to the crops that grow where this bee is naturally distributed. And that would be from about Virginia northward on the East Coast. And you can see here, this is a cross section of the chambers, plural, that the little mason bee has constructed. And these separating walls here are made of that cement. And inside each of the chambers, the solitary bee, she works by herself, has collected pollen and nectar and made this bee bread, this little cake of protein-rich pollen and, of course, sugar-rich nectar packed together, and then with a single egg with that lovely bounty to snack on when that egg hatches. There are masked bees, and if you had the magnification to see this bee close up, you would see that it's got in between its rather large eyes this mask here. This one's visiting a saw palmetto. And if you've seen saw palmetto flowers, you probably get an idea of scale here. This is another one of our smaller or smallest native bees. Larger bees include long-horned bees. They don't actually have horns, but they have these rather robust antennae, um, seen here in the with the segments here. The longhorned bees being, of course, very fuzzy, very bee-like in that respect, and suited to collect nectar with their probing tongue and to collect pollen on their fuzzy bodies. So excellent pollen transfer mechanisms. You may have heard of sweat bees, and this is another whole group of our native pollinators, our native bees that are not honeybees. the little metallic sweat bees that will actually take an interest in your perspiration. They appreciate the salts that they can get nowhere else than your sweat. And here you can see how effective this particular sweat bee is at being that pollen vector. Not only is she collecting pollen in the special little combs on her hind legs, but pollen is literally attracted to her body and is clinging through static electricity. Remind me to tell you about that in a little bit when we get through some of these pollinators. Anyway, cuckoo bees, what's up with that? Do you know the story of the cuckoos, how they lay their eggs in another bird's nest and then their babies kick the original babies out and the parent raises the cuckoo baby? Well, now you do. These bees have the same kind of zeitgeist. These bees will lay their eggs in the nest of another bee. And when their young hatches, it might eat the previous tenant. It might eat the host's larva as a snack and then tuck in to the bee bread. So these bees don't collect any pollen whatsoever. They don't need to. They do drink nectar and they are pollen vectors, but they don't physically collect pollen because they don't need to feed their offspring. They rely on the activity of a different species of bee. The mining bees, these are ground dwelling, of which most of our native bees are ground dwelling, but these are known for building these intricate labyrinths of tunnels and chambers underground. I like their other common name, the fairy bees. These are particularly small little grains of rice that are incredibly important pollinators, especially for our late flowering wildflowers like this honeycomb head, the fairy bees. So there's a sampling of our native bees and their fantastic variety and diversity. They're definitely worth learning more about as individual groups. But we'll just go through some other groups of pollinators. Flies, like we saw before, the bee flies, which are very convincing bee mimics, right down to the fact that they are good pollinators and effective pollinators, and they are nectivorous. That means they drink the nectar that's produced by the flowers to attract their pollen vectors to them. But we have noticed in recent years, since the arrival of love bugs, that they too have a thirst for nectar. And they have found plants that are growing in their newly found environment. They have actually moved into the Southeast United States from Central and South America. The love bugs have, and they love the saw palmetto. The saw palmetto is flowering around the same time that the love bugs emerge. And the vast number of love bugs and the vast number of saw palmetto flowers, those two things go hand in hand. Now, not really enough research has gone into determining how effective the love bugs are at being pollinators, but that electrostatic transfer of pollen certainly applies here. Plants are obviously rooted to the ground and they are grounded. That gives them an overall negative electric charge. A plant in default setting, being grounded, has a negative electric charge. The vibration of insect wings when they fly causes a little bit of static buildup, giving them an overall positive charge. That attraction, when the insect then goes to the flower to get the nectar, the negatively charged pollen is physically, electrostatically attracted to the body of the positively charged insect. And that causes that pollen to stick like a sock in the dryer to the body of that insect. So by sheer reason of electrostatic attraction, love bugs are undoubtedly carrying pollen as they visit these various flowers in their new environments. Beetles, very effective and ancient, among the first of the pollinating insects. It was the beetles that were among the first insects to form associations with flowers. And they're still effective pollinators today. They're just not as worldwide known as pollinators, but they're very busy in the natural world, visiting flowers, collecting pollen, transferring that pollen, getting the nectar reward. This little Florida flower scarab even imitates the appearance of a bee so that he will be left alone, here again on wild coffee and sharing some real estate with a love bug. The butterflies, as I mentioned before, they're very, by and large, the butterflies are very prissy about getting dirty and they don't want to get that nasty pollen all over them. Butterflies have spurs on their long legs that they can actually they can like wipe their feet. They can clean their legs off of this nasty pollen. And they have that very long and slender proboscis that can reach past the dirty anthers and get to the nectar reward. But there are some squatter, their stature is more squat, butterflies like the skippers and the hair streaks that have fatter, fuzzier bodies that just by default might be dragging their heavy, hairy abdomen around on flowers as they're visiting and collecting nectar. As we mentioned, moths with their overall much more fuzzy bodies, um, many moths do not even feed when they are adults. They spend their lives, of course, as caterpillars, and after they pupate in their cocoons, they emerge as adult moths, and many moths don't feed as adults. They only reproduce. But some moths do feed, like the coffee-loving Pyrosta moth, a very colorful day-flying moth for all intents and purposes, kind of seeming butterfly-like. It's a very small moth, and you can see it here visiting the turkey tangle frog fruit, turkey tangle frog fruit. Anyway, the moths, those that feed, can be very effective pollinators. And finally, wasps. And again, wasps aren't known for being particularly fuzzy, and they don't necessarily collect pollen because the wasps are carnivorous. Bees are basically vegetarian wasps. Our bees that eat pollen and drink nectar, they're basically an offshoot of the wasps that have gone vegetarian. The wasps, on the other hand, they will take nectar. It's nutrient dense, it's high energy, it's the Red Bull of the wasp world. But they also will feed their offspring with the meat that they collect, spiders and caterpillars and all sorts of other things. But they themselves, in their feeding on nectar, can be quite effective pollinators. I do want you to look closely at this photograph of some potter wasps on goldenrod and look who they're sharing the feast with. Yes, it's a fly. It's a familiar fly. It's a mosquito. I'm sorry, mosquitoes, certain species of mosquitoes are actually very important pollinators, and we have to provide for everything. So that's an overall view of the variety of our different pollinator groups, the native bees, the flies, moths, and so on, butterflies. Let's take a look at what all the pollinators prefer. We know they like nectar. We know they like flowers. I wish that this picture had come out clearer because wouldn't you just love to be this bumblebee? Just face down in your favorite food, and you've got this flower is just built to provide a place to rest and eat and just spend the day lying on the couch eating nectar. Not bad. So what do they prefer? They prefer flowers, but they prefer flowers and nectar everywhere. They need multi-layered access to flowers. So to provide a fully rounded landscape for pollinators, it's important to consider the various layers of that landscape. Not just all pretty flowers on the ground. You need to give them the diversity of and the access to various flower shapes and locations within the up and down axis of the pollinators world. And the diversity of flower shapes. A diversity of flower shapes is much more important than a diversity of flower colors. Flower colors are given a lot of gravitas, a lot of weight in considering a pollinator planting, but it's really not as important as a variety of flower shapes. And you may not have considered the different shapes that flowers appear in. The reason that flowers take on different shapes is to facilitate their pollination. The reason that flowers are shaped the way they are is to facilitate getting their pollen to a member of their own species somewhere else. And so flowers exist in a variety of basic shapes and forms. The simplest and most inexpensive flower to form would be an open flower, a bowl-shaped or a platter-shaped flower with the nectar in the center and a ring, kind of an obstacle course of pollen-bearing structures that surround that nectar reward in the middle. This is our native pine barren frostweed with its classic kind of flattened bowl open flowers that invite pollinators to land from any direction. There are flowers that are funnel shaped. You may be familiar with our wild petunia, not a real petunia, um, but it's got a similar shape and colored flower. It's funnel shaped like a petunia. The petals are fused and they form this funnel shape. So the pollinator is actually invited to go down into the funnel to access the nectar. In doing so, of course, they're going to run the gauntlet of passing the pollen-bearing structures to get covered in pollen. And of course, the predators are fully aware of the value of various flower shapes in um, an ambush predation. Brush-shaped flowers. These flowers often lack petals or have very, very, very small petals. If you have a red maple in your uh, if you have access to a red maple right now, they are flowering and they are providing these brush-shaped flowers to the very, very bravest and earliest and hardiest of our native pollinators. They stick their stamens right out into the environment, and they have these tiny, tiny little reduced petals. They're not really attracting any attention. Their color, the color of the bud, the color of the petals themselves, and this little petiole or pedicel peduncle that the flower is sitting on, also pigmented, attracting the pollinators, but they're not going to get to their nectar reward without passing these brush shapes and thus being covered in their pollen. Another example of a brush-shaped inflorescence, a bunch of tiny little flowers, is the sunshine mimosa. So you're now familiar with, you get it, you get that there are brush-shaped flowers. So just think of the variety that we've seen so far, the bowl-shaped, the funnel-shaped, the brush-shaped. Here's a gullet-shaped flower, and all of these different flower shapes are necessary in their diversity to attract the widest variety of pollinators and to provide for the greatest variety. Some of our native pollinators are particular to a particular flower shape. They might be particular to a flower species. And so to have the greatest diversity, not in color, but in shape, wherever you have access to doing any sort of planting or provision for pollinators, just keep that need for diversity in mind. The iris that flowers in mid-spring here, our native iris, the blue flag, is actually physically opened by the pollinator that visits it. That takes a pretty robust pollinator. So nothing is going to be able to compete with this large bumblebee for access to the nectar and thus access to the pollen by prying open this iris flower to get at that reward. The composite flowers, these are probably the easiest to provide to our pollinators. There is the greatest abundance, and they really do have value for money. The composite flowers are so called because they are a collection of tiny little tubular flowers. There's a tubular flower. When I say tubular, you know what I mean? Like a toilet paper tube. So the petals are all fused into a tube structure. And what we're looking at here on this compass plant is, 30 individual tiny little flowers, each one with a pollen and a nectar reward. So just landing on this huge composite of tiny little flowers gives the pollinator the opportunity to visit many, many without having to fly away. And there is a huge variety of composites. One thing to avoid when choosing flowers to provide for pollinators is to avoid overly cultivated flowers. And when I say that, I mean flowers that have been hybridized and bred and they look nothing like their wild origins where they've come from. On the left, we have an example. A wild rose is an open bowl-shaped flower. A overly hyper-cultivated rose has had all of those otherwise reproductive structures, the stamens, um, and beyond mutated into extra petals. And so the flower on the right is an overly cultivated rose that is now unable to reproduce on its own. It can only be reproduced by humans as a clone, and it really doesn't provide much for the pollinators. Even if there was a little bit of nectar producing tissues down in this, it would take an awful lot of effort for our pollinators to get in there for minimum reward. So avoid these overly cultivated, these double flowers. Stick to the species or as close to the species as possible. And we will now take a look at some examples. I showed you some photographs of some different flower types with some names associated. And now we'll look at a sampling of some of the native plants that are available for purchase, are available in the trade. They're not obscure and only found in a certain, sand hill in one county. No, these are flowers that are now available thanks to the interest in native plant gardening. We actually have a list of pollinator plants on our Bee City USA website. We'll take a look at that. I'm not going to click this link just now. We'll take a look at that at the end. Um, Here's a little metallic sweat bee about the size of a grain of rice. And you can see she's busy collecting pollen in her pollen baskets on this plant called wireweed. We'll start with trees and shrubs. So again, we're going to have a multi-layered landscape. We're going to start with the trees, the highest layer. We're going to accommodate the bees that are flying in the upper part of the column of air of our atmosphere. And an excellent plant for our early waking bees, native bees, is the flatwoods or the Chickasaw plum. Two very similar species, both suited to grow and thrive in Pinellas County. They are small trees, only get to be about at most 30 feet tall, at most. A good candidate for planting around the perimeter of your landscape because they're not going to grow up and into the power lines. They stay small. They're relatively long-lived. And in the spring, they have one single enormous flush of flowering, of this flowering event that provides a lot of provision for our early spring pollinators to get their colonies started. The flowers look like typical cherry blossoms of which they are related to cherries. They're called a plum because they do have a stone fruit, a single seeded fruit that develops after the pollinators have visited the flower. I believe it's edible. I believe it's, I also believe that it's not really worth depriving our wildlife of this limited food source when we've got plenty at the Publix. So let's just grow a hog plum and let the birds have the plums, and then they can eat the plum and plant a new one somewhere else. This is the size and the shape of the flatwoods plum or the hog plum. Another large shrub or small tree to add height and provide for the higher flying pollinators would be Walter's viburnum. This is a popular, mostly evergreen plant. They've kind of now, just now in January, dropped their leaves. They're going to exchange their leaves for a new flush in the next couple of weeks. But right now is pretty much the only time of year that they don't have leaves all over. And again, in the spring, they have this synchronized flowering event that attracts all manner of pollinators, even and especially this interesting hummingbird moth, one of the few moths that feed when they're adult. And this one is a bee mimic, just like that fly is a bee mimic. This moth is a bee mimic, although we call it a hummingbird moth because you can see almost it beat its large wings, and it's about the size of a hummingbird as well. It's a pretty big moth. It uses the Walters viburnum not only for nectar and for pollen, but it also uses the Walters viburnum to lay its eggs on. Its caterpillars feed on Walters viburnum. So Walters viburnum, a good addition to the landscape. We saw a few slides earlier on of saw palmetto flowers being visited by a variety of pollinators, and saw palmetto is a very valuable pollinator plant. You may not have quite enough room for saw palmetto in your own garden. Saw palmetto is fire adapted. So saw palmetto does not really have an ultimate size. It keeps growing until a fire comes through and knocks it back down and gets it to start over again. So you could end up with a huge, overwhelming section of saw palmetto that you would have to physically go in and deck to the ground every 5 years or so just to get it to rejuvenate and to refresh itself. There's a orange line here through Schefflera. You might be familiar with Schefflera. That's an invasive plant that has gone and gotten itself rooted in amongst these saw palmettos, making it probably much more difficult to get rid of once it's gotten itself up in the saw palmetto. Um, a more landscape friendly alternative to saw palmetto might be the dwarf palmetto. This is a Florida native palm that is called sable minor. It is actually a cabbage palm relative, which of course becomes a big tree. This is a smaller version of that. If it does ever produce an above ground stem, it takes a very long time, but it will flower at a young age. You can see this plant is nothing but leaves coming out of the ground, and it also has initiated a flower spike here that has gone into fruit. So it has actually ripened fruit. It has been a great um, pollinator attractor, as proof is in the fruiting event. So dwarf palmetto might be a good alternative. But no matter what, either one of these palm trees, when they do flower, they flower profusely. Thousands upon thousands of tiny little white flowers, each with its nectar reward and each with an abundance of pollen that can attract our friends like the fat fuzzy bodied hair streaks, like we mentioned before. This is the great purple hair streak. Its larva feeds on mistletoe. A couple of smaller shrubs, evergreen shrubs that might be interesting to add to your middle ground of your landscape would be something like the fetterbush. There's several different species of native fetterbush. The different Lyonia. There's a rusty Lyonia, a shiny Lyonia. Shiny Lyonia is also called fetterbush. Coastal plain Lyonia. They are all blueberry relatives, so they attract those that are buzz pollinators, like the various bumblebees. And sweet spire Itea virginica. This one would love to live in a very cultivated garden, one where you have a very rich soil, lots of compost added to the soil, um, a long history of mulching. This is a plant that in the wild likes to grow in the swamp. So it loves a rich, wet soil. So you would kind of need to provide for this plant if that's one that you wanted to choose for your garden. Here's that rusty Lionia, another one of the blueberry relatives. And here it's being host to a Florida fairy bee, one of the little mining bees. And I prefer the common name fairy bees. Another mid-sized shrub is buttonbush. When this shrub flowers in late spring and early summer, it has quite a long flowering, and it kind of piggybacks on the early spring flowering trees and shrubs. This one fills that gap. The Cephalanthus does. We get a lot of questions about this one. This one grows also in the swamp with its feet in the water. And because of these crazy Sputnik looking inflorescences, unfortunately bearing a striking resemblance to the coronavirus, which we kind of nicknamed it a few years ago. But this one is also a magnet for anything in the neighborhood when it's flowering. It is the brush shape here covering a visiting early season bumblebee. Again, this is probably that queen that overwintered and she's just woken up and she's getting ready and she's going to start her little colony, her little limited sized colony, uh, using the uh, abundant nectar of the Cephalanthus. You may be familiar with tea bush. This is one that was kind of new to me when I moved back to Florida after being gone for, I don't know, 20 years, 30 years. I never saw this one in the wild before, and I still haven't. But it is in cultivation. It is available as a evergreen landscape plant. It gets to be about 7 or 8 feet tall and maybe 4 to 6 feet wide. So plan accordingly if tea bush is going to be introduced into your landscape. Give it plenty of room. It's another one of those mid-sized pollen and nectar sources, Malokia. Here we have a mason bee visiting Malokia, and look at her nectar probing tongue sticking out there. And you can just see the static cling effect of these pollen grains that are stuck to her butt. She's not actively collecting pollen. You don't see any pollen in her baskets. She's more concerned with collecting that nectar. So she's probably her job within her sphere right now is to collect nectar. Bees can specialize one or the other, depending on the availability of whichever of those two resources are most available. Moving down towards the bottom of the garden, we're going to look at the herbaceous layer. That's the plants that get to be about knee-high. One of our very favorite, when I say our, I mean Liz and Clint, one of their favorite um, of the early wildflowers is the pennyroyal. This is a wealth of nectar and pollen for early spring pollinators. This pennyroyal is actually related to, and you might see the resemblance, it's related to our culinary herbs like rosemary and thyme and oregano. If you've ever grown any of those plants, perhaps you can see the resemblance. This one is not used, as far as I know, culinarily. It does have an essential oil in its leaves that is very highly scented. It has kind of a camphor, a very strong, minty smell. But it does produce these pom-poms of spotted flowers, and it is beloved of lots of different of our native bees and native pollinators. Here's again a little mason bee, a little beautiful blue mason bee visiting that pennyroyal in a photograph by Clint. Blue-eyed grass. This is another plant that's now widely available as a landscape plant. Although it only flowers once a year in the spring, it does flower for a whole month. When it gets going, it's ready to flower for an entire month. We have about 3 waves of blue flowered spring wildflowers. And this is the second wave. The first wave is a plant called lobelia. The first wave is lobelia, the second wave is blue-eyed grass, and then the third wave is toadflax. But blue-eyed grass is actually a perennial. It's available commercially, and it's a favorite. I keep saying that. Just about any wildflower is a favorite of our native pollinators, but to provide, it's important to mention those plants that we can actually get our hands on and grow easily in our gardens. Ideally, Cicericium, this blue-eyed grass, would look like this. I will tell you from experience that it is most often a floppy mess, but it's a pretty mess. We all know people like that, don't we? Um, and now for some composites. We mentioned this is a one-stop shop. If you visit this inflorescence, it's a bunch of tiny little flowers. So green eyes is a very long flowering composite flower in the daisy group of flowering plants. Perhaps you can see the sunflower group of flowering plants. Green eyes is now available commercially, and it is one of the few that will flower for months on end. Now, the individual inflorescence, this little collection of tiny little flowers, once they're all visited, that whole thing will go to seed, but it will produce another composite of tiny little tubular flowers to follow this one. And that cycle will continue for quite a few weeks in the early summer, providing lots and lots of nectar. But here you can see a variety of those yellow composite flowers. There's compass plant in the upper left. There's honeycomb head, very late flowering, one of our latest flowering of our yellow composites. There's a sunflower there on the far right. In the lower center is our state wildflower, the coreopsis, another yellow composite. And finally, in the lower left-hand corner, we have a plant called Phabanthus, um, which I believe is its common name as well, Phoebanthus, Phabanthus. It means clear, clear flower because it's this beautiful, clear yellow color. It faces upwards, generally speaking. I haven't seen this one in the trade too much, but I just wanted to give you an idea that any not overly cultivated sunflower type is wonderful for our pollinators because again, it's that one-stop shop. And there are other composites that aren't just yellow blanket flower. I suppose anyone who gardens with native plants grows Gaillardia. This is another one that flowers for most of the growing season. And despite the fact that it has been found that it's not technically a Florida native plant, it has certainly made itself at home and has not become a nuisance. It is a North American native plant that has historically not been found in Florida outside of cultivation. Another composite that, if you're brave and if you're really committed, you might want to introduce into your landscape the purple thistle. This is, I mentioned earlier, this is a specialist flower for a specialist bee, and it certainly does attract a host of other pollinators as well, but it is armored. Everything about this plant, probably its roots, has got these angry spines. The leaves makes this, I mean, its name is Circerum horridulum because it is horrid. You don't want to step on it. Um, but boy, is it cool when it flowers and the things that you can see visiting this plant. There's another species of thistle that's native to Pinellas called nuttall's. This one is not nearly as horridulous, but it might be a little bit more difficult to source and grow. But if you can find thistle, we would certainly recommend introducing thistle. A thistle-like plant is chaffhead. And chaffhead, you get the benefit of that beautiful lavender flower without the horridulous spiny leaves. Chaffhead is an autumn flowering, so September, October flowering plant. And here it's being visited by one of those heavier bodied butterflies, one of the skippers. This is the long-tailed skipper. So even though it's trying not to get pollen on itself, it probably still is. Goldenrod has a reputation of being very irritating for sufferers of hay fever. But goldenrod is actually a member of the composite group. It's a yellow composite, and its pollen is sticky and is attracted to and is attractive to our native bees, like this little blood bee. Goldenrod is welcome in the garden. Its pollen is not an airborne irritant. Its pollen is sticky and it sticks to pollinators, and it's a wonderful. There are many different species of goldenrod native to our area, native to Florida, uh, none of which are going to cause you any um, respiratory distress. So do invite goldenrod in one of its many forms, from very small to very large, and welcome pollinators forthwith. And we'll finish up with a couple of ground covering plants. They're probably familiar to you. I think anybody who grows native plants has tried at least to grow the sunshine mimosa, that classic brush-shaped flower. This is not an unbroken carpet of green leaves like many people would desire to have for a lawn. You can see that once it does get established, it is kind of rangy, allowing for space in between the branches that lay prostrate on the ground with their sensitive leaves that fold up. That's good fun. When you have company, you can actually take them out and show them how your sensitive plant will fold up when you touch it. But anyway, a ground cover for the lowest level, for those pollinators that are visiting in the lower of the air column around your sphere of influence. And of course, we saw before with the coffee-loving moth, the coffee-loving parista moth on the turkey tangle frog fruit. This is another plant that's very attractive to butterflies. They can get into this flower, these individual tiny little white flowers. They can stand on the top of this inflorescence and poke their proboscis down into the flowers and not get any of that dirty pollen on them. But there are plenty of pollinators that do visit those flowers, are in scale with those flowers, and are effective pollinators for them. So let's now move on to the best practices. Now, these are the best practices. This is almost all of the best practices. Now, do you need to do all of them? No. Do you need to be inspired by at least one? Sure. If you are inspired to approach just one of these best practices, you are doing good, and you are benefiting our native pollinators that need you. The number one thing, spoken like a true educator, is to learn. And you've done it today. Look, you can tick one box. You've begun to learn about our native pollinators and the things that they need. Learn that this creature is not a wasp. It looks like a wasp. It's not a wasp. It's a pebble bee. You're learning that there's a thing called a pebble bee. That's pretty cool. That looks like a wasp, but it's not. It's a vegetarian. Bees are vegetarian wasps. So you learn that too. This is an important pollinator. Why is it called a pebble bee? Because it collects pebbles, little tiny pebbles, and it sticks them together with glue, and it makes this little adobe igloo for its offspring. Cool. Don't you now want to see a pebble bee? Well, let's learn some things to do to make your habitat welcoming to the pebble bees. 1A, you need to think like a bee. So what do bees need? We know they need flowers. They need a diversity of flowers, not just colors, but shapes and locations. They need flowers up high, they need flowers in the middle, they need flowers down low. So if you're missing something there, if you're imagining yourself to be a bee and you need something up high, if you're missing something, introduce a species into your garden, or a hanging basket might provide that resource up high for those bees that are seeking up high. We also ask, number two, a good practice is to accept that we have these various different pollinator groups. And believe that all these groups are equally important to the health and the maintenance of our wild areas and the areas that are doing their best to try and be wild in between our developments in this overly developed county, right down to the wasps. Wasps aren't going to bother you really if you don't bother them. Um, okay, tolerate might be a better way to look at this. If you cannot tolerate having paper wasps anywhere near you, we can accept that. But just try not, whatever control measure you take to eliminate the paper wasp, make sure it doesn't get all over everything else. You know what I'm saying? We certainly would never expect anyone to tolerate ground nesting yellow jackets. We wouldn't expect anyone to, if the ground nesting yellow jackets were causing an impediment to the natural flow of life and livelihood around your home. If you can leave them alone, good idea, but we would accept um, not to tolerate everything. Prepare yourself the prepare yourself to create this habitat. So here is a great clean slate. Here is an opportunity to go in and establish a pollinator welcoming environment. Now, is a flat lawn and a couple of plants and heavy mulch going to do it? No, but it is a start. You've got the space now. That's one thing. Let's now prepare to take the plunge and create a habitat for the pollinators and then commit to it. Commit to what level you want to choose. How committed are you going to be to this exercise? Are you going to do a few things? Are you going to try and do everything? Let me tell you, if you try and do everything, you're probably not going to, and you're going to get discouraged and stop everything. So maybe just pick one. Uh, Choose your level of commitment. Anything that you do is better than nothing. Step number 4 is to get it. Okay, now I get it. Now I get what the pollinators need. They need flowers. They need flowers at different levels. And here we have a person that installed a Florida-friendly landscape. They're doing great. They're saving money on water. They're using some, okay, one native plant. They're doing good. They kind of get it. They kind of get it. It's okay to kind of get it at first. And as you spend a year kind of getting it, things will begin to click, and you'll learn that 3 inches of mulch might be Florida friendly and it might be saving on watering, but 3 inches of mulch might not be the best for our native pollinators. Number 5, don't mow. How are you going to enforce that? How are you going to tell someone in your household don't mow between November and May? How are you going to stop them? You might not be able to, but if it's up to you for the pollinators, it would be really nice if during the dry season, spend that time maintaining the mower, get the yeah, new spark plugs, drain the gas, clean the lines or whatever, sharpen the blades, lift the deck up as high as you can. So when you do go out to mow, you're not shaving down all of the early spring flowering wildflowers. Try not to mow between November and May. You don't need to. You really don't, honestly. Try and make the case, but don't be ugly. Don't shake your finger in somebody's face and say, don't do that. You're not supposed to mow between November and May because you're not going to convince them that way. Okay? Do your best. Be convincing. Be encouraging. If it's not you that does the mowing and you're having to convince someone, hey, it's a lot easier to not do something. Okay. Try your best not to mow between November. Okay, no more countdowns. We'll just look at some more um, best practices. Now, we all like flowers, and we all know the pollinators like flowers because that's where the pollen comes from. It's where the nectar comes from. We get some pollen from pine trees. They don't make nectar. They're more wind pollinated. They're more anti-insect anyway. So we have these flowers that are making this pollen and all this. So where do we get our flowers? Where do we get flowers? Be careful. Remember we talked earlier about using plants that are closer to the wild types because the wild types are going to have the flowers that are built to facilitate pollination, and the plants that are over cultivated are going to have bunched up flowers like these marigolds that if they do have any pollen or nectar, it's going to be too hard to get to. Choose wisely. Join native plant societies. Go to native plant society plant sales. Be careful of plants, and I'm not allowed to smack talk the big box stores, so I won't. Um, be cautious when visiting nurseries where everything looks the same and it's all been grown on there's not a bug bite anywhere. No leaves have been chewed. The flowers are, there's probably a certain level of pesticide that has gone into the production of these plants. And you do not want to introduce pesticide laced plants into your garden. So if you can find organic, if you can find locally grown, locally raised, grow your own from seed. Try growing plants from seed. Now, is it the worst thing in the world to get plants from big box stores? Absolutely not. Getting these plants into the landscape is better than not. But if you have the choice, try to source wisely and avoid plants that might be harboring systemic pesticide. I honestly don't like the looks of these people's faces. I wouldn't trust them. I'm not going to shop there. Anyway, there's more to life than eating. There's more to life than nectar, right? We'd all like to be this bumblebee asleep with our face in a big pot of nectar. Um, I mentioned before, most of our bees, 70% of our native bees are not colonial. They don't live in hives. They don't have they're solitary and they make little nests in the ground. They don't make hives. They don't have there's not, beehives for our native bees. They make these little small openings in bare ground. So we need to provide that bare ground. Pine straw mulch is a good alternative to that 3 inches of bark mulch. Now, of course, Florida Friendly is going to tell you that bark mulch is great because it doesn't break down. You can keep it for a long time and it's going to continue to hold in that moisture level. That's fine. But we want to expand out a little bit and provide for pollinators, and we need to provide that bare ground. Pine straw mulch is a good alternative because it doesn't work very well and it gets thin in areas. And where it thins out, it provides access to bare ground. Um, Provide bare ground where you can. Do you have an area that just nothing will grow in? Celebrate it. Put a little sign up that says, "This is bare ground for ground nesting bees." Do not mow. Um, why would you need to mow bare ground anyway? I know it's a stretch to have a lawn that has patches of bare ground, but it's incredibly important for our ground nesting species. You can use your own leaves to mulch with. Again, it doesn't last very long, only through the winter months, perhaps, and then it's all broken down and washed away. And if you don't remove your leaves from your landscape and put them into the garbage and have them hauled away, it's very likely that you'll be maintaining some of the overwintering structures that are used by animals like the Luna moth. They have their cocoons in the leaf litter that are waiting for the spring to emerge. So if you haven't raked up all your leaves, you may be leaving the Luna moth caterpillars behind. And speaking of leaving, wait to cut back last year's growth. Let it be a part of your seasonal landscape. The old dead stems are very often habitat. Not only habitat, but they could actually be nesting possibilities for some of our native pollinators. So leave the brambles. Here's a photograph that Liz took of some sleeping bees. These sweet little sleepy bees. She actually got a prize for this. They've got their little mandibles clamped down on this old flower stalk, and they're just asleep, holding on by their little teeth. Just provide for this. Who wouldn't want that happening? Um, Here's a little carpenter bee using the hollow stem of sumac. Now, a landscape person might have seen the land that the sumac has dropped all of its leaves and they chop it down to the ground. Chop it about knee high, and you've got this hollow stem that's just perfect size and shape and position for the actions of the small carpenter bees. Here's another natural twig with a hollow pith that's just the right size and shape and orientation for the little carpenter bees. So, on the subject of providing habitat, we'll talk briefly about these bee houses. They're everywhere now. You can buy them, you can make them. We had a wildflower festival back in October. We provided them as a build it yourself kit. Certainly, as I've said before, bee houses, bee hotels, anything you do is better than not doing anything as long as you have an interest in providing for native pollinators and providing for these native pollinators, which then has the knock-on effect of making the whole environment better. But get the bee houses right. If you're going to invest in bee houses, let's get it right. They're used by a variety of native bees. The mason bees we mentioned before, here they are using here she is using cement to create those little chambers. She uses cement that she collects from mud puddles. You got a mud puddle that's always a problem? It's not a problem. Don't worry about fixing it. Having a mud puddle somewhere in your sphere is not necessarily the worst thing in the world. It could be the only water around at certain times of year. Could you provide a dish of mud? Yes, that's a level of commitment that's a little bit beyond me, but it is certainly possible to provide a dish of mud that your mason bees could take advantage of, and your potter wasps as well, to build these structures. The leafcutter bees also will use these bee houses, bee hotels. Here you can see the little scraps of leaves that came from the edges of leaves that you can see, and also tolerate the action of the leafcutter bees in your garden. You see this damage to leaves? Don't get the spray out. The plant's going to make plenty more leaves, and the bee is going to take advantage of just as much as she needs and no more. Tolerate that damage. So does a bee house have to be fancy? No, it doesn't have to be fancy. It just has to be um, tubes. Tubes are what these bees are looking for. Tubes that are normally excavated by, say, birds, maybe woodpeckers, making a hole in the side of a tree looking for grubs, or the action of carpenter bees who can actually excavate tubes for their own use. And once they have left, then a different species could come in and use that pre-excavated tube, or we could provide cheap and cheerful bamboo stakes cut into about 6-inch lengths with a half-inch opening. Very simple. If you put them out, they will be found. So having a bee house is certainly an enjoyable activity. It is an educational activity. Um, it pays off and that you are doing something good for the pollinators in your area. How long do they last? Well, they last as long as the bees use them. And if you're hyper committed, um, you can be very interactive with your bee house. you can be hyper uncommitted and put it up and never think about it again, ever. Or you could put it up and visit it and say, hey, it's being used and be done with it. Or you could be hyper committed and every time one of your tubes is capped, which is what this has happened here. The bee has built a series of chambers that has ended up with this last chamber, and she's put a cap on the very end, removing that tube from the bee house and putting it into a box in a protected area with a small exit hole about the size of the tube that you've got inside the box. And you could put as many of these inhabited tubes in the box as you want, so that when the bees emerge from these tubes, when the young bees hatch and grow out of these tubes, they'll find a place to escape and they'll never go back in. Um, that's like level 3. So quick facts about maintaining a bee house: use natural materials, not plastic or glass, because you're going to want to keep these things moving. As soon as a tube has been used, as soon as it is vacated, it needs to be got rid of. A half inch is really the ideal diameter. Um, if you do put it up and leave it, then maybe once a year you'll need to go through and take out tubes that either haven't been used or have been used and abandoned, um, and then take it all apart and disinfect the whole thing with some bleach after it's all taken apart. These bee houses are an unnatural concentration of individuals. Now, I recognize that we are an overdeveloped county and there isn't much space for every bee to have all the space that it needs. So, just like people live in apartments, even though they don't really want to, in the interest of space, so too we put up these bee houses. It's an unnatural concentration. So, disease can spread through these things. Um, Parasites can spread through these things. So it's real important to keep them clean every year or two. Take it completely apart and bleach it, kill all the parasites, the disease, the fungus, the bacteria, and then start over again. Provide an overhang for your bee house, so that it is protected from, heavy, heavy rain, that sort of thing. Try facing it east so that it gets the morning sun to dry it out, and then the afternoon shade from the hottest sun of the day. If you can stagger the openings, that's great because that makes more sense to the little bee brains. Um, keep it about 5 feet off the ground so that the lizards don't come and just eat the little babies as they emerge. Get it up and out of the way, from predators. And that emergence box, you can read more about emergence boxes if you want to be that interactive, where you take an inhabited tube out of the setup and put it into a box separate from the rest of the condo with a single exit hole. So as the young leave, they can exit the emergence box and never go back in. Um, I did mention that there is a Bee City USA Pinellas County. We are members of Bee City USA. We have created Bee City USA website on the Pinellas County government website. We have lots of information there currently, but we have great plans to put lots more. I mentioned that because we are going to have a whole section on how to bee houses. We also have in the chat, Julius just placed links to a couple of publications about best management for bee houses, when to clean, how to clean, what materials to use. They have done the research. It's fantastic stuff. But right now you can find this information on our website with lots more to come in the coming days. I invite you definitely, I'm sure you do want to know more about our native bees, tune in on the 24th of January, again at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, for Surprising Native Bees of Pinellas, a class taught by Liz, where you will learn not only how to surprise native bees, but just how surprising our native bees can be. So certainly hope that you will tune into that. That's a free webinar. The sign up for that webinar is going to go in the chat as well. It's another Zoom class on the 24th. But I need to butt out. That's me done for the day, for today. I have certainly enjoyed bringing you some information about our native bees, about our native pollinators, about, I hope that I have empowered or encouraged at least one of you to do the smallest thing, make the smallest change, try something out for the benefit of our native pollinators. So with this be but, I'm going to say good afternoon. I encourage you at all times to reach out if you have any questions, comments, or complaints. Do reach out. My email is here on the screen. And while you fill out this very quick and easy poll, I will have a drink of water and turn my attention to the Q&A. If you wouldn't mind just filling out this quick poll, just a few questions. It helps us to improve and alter our presentations as we strive to become better and better at bringing you research-based environmental education. We do have a question in the Q&A, and please clarify stagger openings. Good catch. I'm going to back the slideshow up a little bit and show you a array. This would be an array of these bamboo stakes that this person has cut to 6-inch lengths. And the openings of all of these tubes are all uniform. They're all, the openings of all of these tubes are on the same plane. Ideally, if you have the dexterity to maybe pull some of these out at different lengths so that the entrance to some is closer to you and the openings to others is further away so that they're not all on the same plane. That's what we mean by staggering those opening sizes. So I appreciate your attention this afternoon. I hope you enjoyed our presentation, and we certainly do hope to see you again in future. Thanks for joining us today.